Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Townsend Center. My name's Stephen Best. I'm director of the Townsend Center. Marty, we were saddened to hear that you'd had an accident, but we are glad to see that you're up and on the mend. We're pleased to host you again in the book chat series and look forward to your discussion with Peng Chia of your most recent book, Magical Nominalism, the historical event, aesthetic reenactment, and the photo. Before I hand things over to Marty and Peng, I'd like to remind everyone that the Townsend Center will be hosting its Avenali lecture next week with the psychoanalyst Avgi Sakatopoulou. The lecture, Fighting Fire with Fire, Aesthetics, Exigent Sadism, Insurgency, will take place on Monday, October 6th in the Maud Fife Room, and on October 7th, Sakatopoulou will be in conversation with our colleagues Damon Young from Film and Media, Paola Bacchetta, and Eric Stanley, both of Gender and Women's Studies. This is a rather social sciencey group, if I'm reading the room right, but I will make one more announcement, which is that next Wednesday, October 8th, the leadership of the National Humanities Center will hold a faculty information center here at the Townsend Center. NHC's president, Blair Kelly, and vice president for scholarly programs, Martha Kelly, will present an overview of the NEH's fellowship and research support and offer tips for writing strong proposals and getting advice during the application process. So that event will happen on October 8th at 5 o'clock in this room. So looking forward to your conversation, Marty and Peng.
Thank you. So I think we should start because we are on a very tight schedule. And this is such a large book and wide-ranging in its scope that I'm sure you have lots of questions to ask. It's a great pleasure to be doing this. It's such a wide-ranging book that I can't really do it justice. I learned a great deal from the chapters on photography, art, and music, things I know very little about. And even the stuff that I've published on, like the Derrida or the Deleuze, I found that I, saw it in a different perspective. I'm also doing this with a little melancholy because this is your 20th book and you are saying this is your last book. At least that's the dedication to Kathy. I hope it's not the last book. But in any case, I was wondering if we could start and ask you to take us through the different conceptual distinctions that are at the heart of the book and the different stages of the argument of the book. So you distinguish magical nominalism from conventional nominalism and also realism. And in relation to conventional nominalism, you describe it as an alternative form of nominalism. But you also distinguish magical nominalism from a third type of nominalism, Jewish nominalism. And then in chapters 3 to 5, you analyze 3 different instances, first in historical discourse, then in aesthetics, and then in photography. So could you just quickly take us through, for people who haven't read the book, how are these different instances related? Do they form an open-ended series?
Thanks, Mike. First, thanks to Stephen and the Townsend Center for allowing me to do this yet again. It's a great privilege and wonderful to see so many old friends and to see new faces here as well. And thanks to Peng for wading through the book and coming up with some really hard questions. The first one is the hardest of all because in a way, I don't want to do definitions. I mean, the book is in a way positioned against the idea that you use a category, either one that you find or the one that you create, and then find instances, exemplars that can be subsumed under it. So the book resists definitions. That's the, in a way, methodological risk of writing a book like this. But having said that, let me define what I have implicitly brought to the surface. All right, so nominalism. Why nominalism? I mean, I got originally, I suppose, the inspiration from Hans Blumenberg's very, very powerful and influential book on the modern age, on the book that tries to talk about its legitimacy, which I reviewed back in the 1980s. And in The Legitimacy of the Modern Age, Bloomberg argues that it was really in the medieval transformation from realism to nominalism that modernity began. It's a very early notion of the beginning of modernity, but it makes a certain sense. And the argument is this, and it leads to what I'll be calling conventional nominalism. It's an argument that is essentially one that situates the philosophical tradition in its theological origins. In the Middle Ages, there was a fairly constant, let's say, debate or at least tension between a version of God as beholden to rules, rationality, to what he had already created, a God who was, whose power was, in the terms of Peter Damian, the 11th century or 12th century, his potesta ordinata, what he'd already, his power, what he'd already ordinated. It was that version of God, a God that was essentially Greek in origin, we might say, a God that emphasized the cosmos as an intelligible order, one that was also available for human intelligence to penetrate, perhaps on a lower level than gods or the angels, but still potentially there for, say, a scholastic system to make sense of. The alternative was a version of God that's perhaps more Hebraic than Greek in origin, which emphasizes a divinity that is not beholden to rules, not beholden to rationality, not beholden to the order that he may have created in the past, but rather a God who's omnipotent, a God whose power, whose potentia absoluta, is such that he can suspend rules, he can have miracles that intervene in the natural order, can have acts that human beings cannot understand, acts that are basically acts that only God can make sense of. And this version of God was one that gained a certain power basically in the 13th century, and the complicated historical reasons why I won't go in now. And what it created was a crisis in the notion of the universal and real order that the, let's say, Neoplatonic version of Christianity had revered, and instead created a God who could basically act contingently, act capriciously, act without giving reasons, act because his will was omnipotent. And this created, we might say, both a kind of opportunity and also a great crisis. The opportunity was the sense that the new could, in fact, enter the world, that it was possible for something that had not been ordained, had not been part of the regular order, to appear. And obviously, the version of religious miracles is part of this. The, we might say, fear was that this left the world basically unmoored, contingent, without order, a world in which there was no way to understand a cosmos that was harmonious, a cosmos that was in tune with human behavior, a cosmos that in a way made sense. It left the possibility of a kind of meaningless world, a world which, you know, this leads all the way up to even 20th century existentialism, that has no inherent order, that has no inherent rationality, whose universals are, as the nominalists themselves, William of Ockham and others argued, mere names that we impose upon it, mere conventions that we humans use to get, in a way, around in a world which is inherently beyond our ken. Now, the opportunity, of course, then, as Blumenberg would argue, is that this gives humans the opportunity in a way to impose their will on the world, as if they were mini creators, as if they were following God's capricious will, as if human self-assertion were possible now that the world was no longer ordered, regular, rational. And it has been argued that this was the beginning of modern self-assertion and, in a way, the domination of nature that has been argued as part of the sinister side of modernity. The Frankfurt School, for example, argued that in Dialectic of Enlightenment. So the crucial thing is that there is now both a possibility for a world which is there for humans to control, to dominate, but also an inherent sense of anxiety. This is still not adequate to the world. So the modern experiment, we might say, based on what I've called conventional nominalism, opens up this world of opportunity, but also a world that involves a kind of almost existential anxiety about God no longer being available, a deus absconditus, a God who is absent from regular reality and that whose ways are beyond our ken. Now, I call this conventional because it is basically the larger, we might say, narrative of nominalism that is narrated from the get-go. one that perhaps loses its theological origins, but continues in contemporary philosophy. Now, in a way, I'm homogenizing a lot of different nominalisms, because if you're a serious student of contemporary nominalism, there are lots of mini varieties: predicate nominalism, trope nominalism. You can go on these ostrich nominalism, lots of different, we might call local variations. But the larger, we might say, school that we call nominalism argues, first, there are no real universals. Second, that there are conventions which humans create linguistically. And third, that what we really have are just particulars. What we really have are just the singularities of the world that are somehow grouped by conventional linguistic models into larger categories, but those categories have less, we might say, ontological force, ontological weight than the individuals which are their particulars. Now, what this book argues is that, yes, this is the dominant version of conventional nominalism, but there is what I discovered in a way, an alternative version, which I want to call magical. Now, what's, I think, in a way, the risk of the book is that this doesn't exist anywhere else except in this book. It's not a term, it's not a term that I found. It's one, to give you the sort of ideology of it, it's a variation of magical realism. Now, that's a term that I'm sure many of you know. It was coined in the 1920s by Franz Roh, who was an art critic in Weimar, Germany. Talked mostly about the so-called new objectivity, Neusachlichkeit, and then was picked up to describe a certain version of fiction that we associate often with writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and others in basically our own era, slightly earlier, and has different connotations. And what I thought when I first, counted magical realism, I thought, well, maybe there's also a magical nominalism as well as a kind of counterpart. However, one that is a counterpart to the realism of the medieval version of that term, the reality of universals, not the realism of, say, 20th century or 19th century fiction. In any event, the magical quality of it, as opposed to the conventional, was the one that I then had to tease out. And here I found myself once again resisting a kind of imposed categorical term, magical nominalism, that I could then define and use as a way to structure everything. Because in a way, this would be performatively a contradiction to what I see magical nominalism telling us to be sensitive to, which is the, we might say, incommensurability of particulars, the irreducibility of particulars to large categories, the, we might say, resistance of the singular to the collective. Magical nominalism captures the nominalist, we might say, anxiety about the imposition of either ontological or even conventional universals, and instead focuses on particulars. But it does so, and this is why it's magical, it does so without the kind of positivist disenchantment of the singulars, which are merely what they are and nothing else. Instead, it is in touch with a certain sense that these particulars are both outside of human control, outside of human constitution. They're not simply projections onto the world, but instead have a quality that inspires a kind of humility, a kind of awe about a world which has its wondrous mysteries that we ourselves cannot fully make sense of. We can't categorize, rationalize, we can't make them into instances of something else, but which nonetheless touch us, which nonetheless, in our experience, are beyond simple facts, simple, dull, dead, positivist facts. And what I try to do in the book is not to give you a kind of overarching definition, but rather to give you exemplars, or what Giorgio Agamben calls paradigms, not quite in the sense that Tom Kuhn used that word, paradigms of magical nominalism, going, as it were, through different instances of it, and trying to show facets rather than instances that are subsumed under the category. So that by the end of the book, the facets add up to, or although in a kind of imperfect way, what the term magical nominalism tries to evoke without a definition. So I end the book with an inconclusive conclusion because I don't want to have a definition at the beginning or a summing up at the end, which is a kind of this is what it all means. This is the takeaway. You can move on now. You've conquered the term. The point is to leave the reader with an appetite still whetted to figure out what the term means, but giving a certain amount of, we might say, guidance. So there are a number of different paradigmatic examples. The one that I begin with basically is Walter Benjamin's notion of linguistic magic, Sprachmagie, which is a term he himself used. Magic is frequently used in Benjamin's vocabulary. And it involves a version of language which is the opposite of what we now, perhaps in a kind of post-Saussurean way, consider a conventional version of language. Instead, it looks for something in language, either in terms of an original Ursprache, a very kind of crazy notion of an original language before Babel, or a version of language which emphasizes the importance of names versus concepts. Concepts overarching, concepts part of conventional nominalism. We use them to construct a world that we can dominate. Names are, in a way, individual. They are without meaning. They are without translatability. They have a kind of, let's say, numinous quality of their own, especially if, and this is the kind of gamble that Benjamin makes, they're the names given by Adam in the Garden of Eden. Adam, the original nomothete, who gives the animals names. Now, there's a big debate in the theological literature. Are these names that were already there, given by God, or does Adam name them himself? Be that as it may, they are the right name. They are the proper name. They are the name that is irreducible to anything else. And there are contemporary philosophers, Saul Kripke and others, who have drawn on this tradition in ways that I'm not fully competent to spell out, but which philosophers in the room will find familiar. So this is a version, we might say, of magical nominalism, which names more than just conceptual, more than just conventional. They have a kind of quality that is even ontological. Maybe this is a crackpot. I'm not sure I buy it. There's a kind of quality in Benjamin's work where he's constantly looking for shards of the residues of this earlier version of a lost, we might say, linguistic truth, the language of God rather than the language of men, as he puts it in one of his early essays. So I move from that to other examples, which are very heteroclite. I mean, the book is kind of a crazy book in which the examples of magical nominalism are not examples that would occur to anybody else. I mean, they grew out of, and I'm very explicit about this, my own previous work. In other words, what I found was that I went back and looked at work I'd done in earlier projects from a different angle and discovered, aha, this might be an exemplar of what I'm talking about, a paradigm in a Goldman sense. So I went from Benjamin and Sprachmagie, Benjamin and the importance of names, a very perhaps religious notion, to the idea of the event, l'événement, Ereignis in Heidegger's terms, in mostly post-structuralist French thought. And I discovered after 1968, which is the period when, of course, les événements happened in Paris, that's what they described the events of May 68, when suddenly, against the structuralist domination of French historiography associated with people like Braudel, they rediscovered the idea of the event. And the event became a kind of numinous term in the philosophy as well as some historiography of many French post-structuralist thinkers. So that chapter spends a great deal of time with Lyotard, with Deleuze, with Derrida, with Foucault, and finally with Alain Badiou, who is a post-structuralist thinker, anti-linguistic, but also has a very numinous notion of the event. Now, how does the event exemplify magical nominalism? Well, basically, it involves an interruption, a singular interruption, in the what we might call narrative historicist flow of meaningful development. It's something that happens. It's not caused. It's not part of the possible circumstances. It's the interruption of the impossible, the interruption of, in a way, the miraculous. And Badiou will, in fact, call his own version of the event comparable to a miracle. It's something we might say shows that normal historical understanding, in which we try to understand causes, context, we try to make developmental arguments, that this is inadequate to the interruption of something that is unexpected. Kairotic time and chronological time in religious terms, a kind of, and sometimes we even think of it as comparable to the incarnation, something that involves a divine interruption in the world of the mundane. So this version of the event, and there are lots of different philosophers who put incredible, almost surprising emphasis on the event as a kind of category. And it was difficult to define. 9/11 maybe was an event. The French Revolution, all 10 years of the decade, was an event. The event itself becomes hard to define, but it is, we might say, a God term in much French thought during this period. So I move from that to something totally different on the chapter on aesthetic reenchantment. And here it's a very complicated argument using Marcel Duchamp's notions, the ready-made, using Adorno's notion of a certain kind of musical nominalism, although Adorno was very critical in many respects of conventional nominalism. He understands music to be, in a way, like the name or like prayer, something that can't be reduced either to the, we might say, imposition of the composer, or simply to the traditional tropes that musical traditions, basically play off. It involves a kind of intervention in the world, which is semi-miraculous, and there's a complicated argument about how close that is to, speaking of miraculous interruption, how close that is to something that involves a kind of wonder at the capacity of music to evoke something that is, he claims, prayer-like. The final chapter moves in a totally different register, and here it discusses the photograph, not photography as an institution, not the idea of the photograph as part of, say, the world involves cinema, but the photograph per se, itself extracted from all of these larger contexts. Now, here the argument is also rather bizarre and complicated. How is the photograph like these other versions of magical nominalism? Well, first of all, it involves an interruption in time, like the historical event. Photograph, the snapshot, in the traditional sense, I mean, we have now ability to show a bit of movement, is basically a rupture in the continuity of time. It captures a moment that in our normal experience is part of a flow, but it extracts it and creates a kind of, basically wondrous and often it's called magical moment of the interruption of temporality. Secondly, it involves also a kind of, we might say, touch of the real. Now, we think of photography as basically visual, but it involves a haptic touch of the real on the, we might say, apparatus, the chemical, through the lens, the chemical preservation of that moment, which has, and this is using the terms of Charles Sanders Peirce, an indexical quality. Now, there's a great debate about whether or not this is a valid way to understand photography, but I basically follow people like Rosalind Krauss who think it's important. As I'm sure many of you know, Peirce argued basically that there are iconic and symbolic ways to give meaning, but there's also an indexical way. A fox leaving tracks in the snow, the windmill that shows the way the wind is blowing. These are traces of the real, we might say, or traces of the object on something that preserves it. It's an indexical trace, index of something that was there. This is what happens with a photograph, basically. A photograph has an index of something which is contingent. And the point of nominalism is, of course, that contingency is more important than rules. And even though one can find a variety of different rules in photography, there are also ways in which the photograph has a spark of contingency. And the theorist of photography who best, I think, articulated this was, of course, Roland Barthes and Cameron Lucida, when he describes the difference between the punctum and the studium of a photograph. The studium being basically what is the conventional message in a photograph. We look at it and we see it as an instance of, I don't know what, a bourgeois picnic at a certain moment in time, and so something that gives us a coded reality which we recognize. The punctum, on the other hand, rarely happens, but it does, on an individual basis, puncture us. It wounds us. It creates a kind of sense of something unexpected. It's something that disturbs. It's something that interrupts. It's something that has the quality of creating, and he even uses the word magic, something that will destroy our sense of the temporal meaningfulness or the contextual meaningfulness of this particular image. Now, there are a variety of other ways to talk about the photograph. I talk about Krakauer and other figures who are interested in the photograph in terms of temporality, mixed temporality, then and now and the future. It gets much more complicated than I can simply recapitulate now. But this is basically the third major paradigm. And the book ends with a discussion of something even more, say, heteroclite, which is the idea of sovereignty in political terms. Conventional nominalism, I would argue, is the source of a certain version of sovereign decisionism, that he who decides, as Carl Schmitt famously said in a state of exception, is the sovereign, the power to decide, the power to, as it were, interrupt the flow, to have, as in the God of the potentia absoluta, the power to disrupt the ordinated rules that have been given legally or otherwise in the past, and to introduce something utterly new. And this version of the sovereign is a very powerful, we might say, ingathering of the strength of the self-assertion that Blumenberg argued was part of the modern, we might call it, worldview, one that involves domination, the powerful sovereign being the one who decides. The magical nominalist version of this is very critical of the idea of the powerful sovereign. And what I do in this last conclusion is go through the ways in which all the figures I've looked at undermine the idea of the strong sovereign. And virtually all the post-structuralists, Adorno, Benjamin, all of them are hostile to the idea of the powerful sovereign. And the figure whose work best illustrates this is Georges Bataille, who had another version of sovereignty from that of Carl Schmitt, one that I dealt with many years ago, one which involves a kind of acephalic, let us say without a head, version of dispersed power, one that is not ingathered in a strong and powerful, we might say, conceptual dominator of the world. So magical nominalism once again produces a kind of humility, a kind of unwillingness to create a power that can control the world that is utterly contingent, but rather tells us, we might say, or alerts us to the fact that the singularities of the world, the, we might say, uncategorizable, maybe even irrational realities of the world, although irrational is a negative connotation usually, these are worth being, let's say, open to. It doesn't mean that this is the answer to big questions. I mean, I don't want this book to be seen as a defense of magical nominalism as a kind of recipe for salvation or redemption, but simply something that gives us a vocabulary to deal with certain ways the world has been appropriated or understood, or we might say opened up by a variety of different thinkers, artists, and even mechanisms or apparatuses like photography in different contexts, with the hope, of course, that there'll be other instances, other exemplars, other paradigms that will follow that I hadn't thought about that will be available for other people. Now, just as a footnote, Peng mentioned Jewish nominalism. We've talked about conventional nominalism in terms that are basically derived from medieval Christianity. Ockham was a Franciscan, very important in opposing the Dominicans in the scholastic tradition. Christian nominalism, we might say, broadly speaking, produced the conventional version that I talked about earlier. A Polish philosopher, a woman named Agata Bielak-Robson, whose work I discovered halfway through my own project, and with whom I've now become, quite engaged with in dialogue over the last few years, has uncovered in her own work the importance of the Lurianic Kabbalah for a version of nominalism, which she now wants to call mystical rather than magical, and wants to identify with a variety of different thinkers that I've included, like Derrida, which is, in some sense, derived from the heterodox tradition of Kabbalistic Judaism. And I think there's a lot of insight in this. I'm still in conversation with her over the difference between mystical or Jewish on the one hand and magical on the other. I stick with magical partly out of a sense that the Jewish derivation, the Jewish lineage, doesn't account for all the things that I want to talk about. It may be useful in certain respects, and Kabbalah has its funny underground, we might say, residue in a lot of modern thought, and Benjamin obviously was identified with it in many respects, but through Gershom Scholem. But I would not argue that, say, the photograph can be understood in its terms. So I'm trying to sort of broaden it. Also, just to make one final point, I'll give Peng a chance to, ask other questions. I want to emphasize magic versus religion, because I'm basically skeptical of the political theology move, which says that virtually all modern thought is a watered down version of earlier theological thought. which makes modern thought basically illegitimate in the sense that Blumenberg was trying to argue against. So what I want to argue is that even in religious thought, there are prior magical elements that are themselves still residually available today. And that religion is itself, theology in particular, a way station to where we are, not simply the origin. That theology is a way to make sense of magical or original religious experiences, whether we call them religious or not, can be defined, can be argued, which then become codified by theology. And theology is not the origin, but rather merely a vocabulary which is used to make sense of them at a certain point in the history of our species, which may now be, pretty much exhausted. But that's a slightly different argument. So that's where the Jewish mystical version versus the magical mystical version, magical non-mystical version of nominalism comes in. Agatha Bielek-Robson has a book en route called Mystical Nominalism, which she spends a long time talking about magical nominalism and tries to argue for her version of it. The term mystical nominalism was first coined, by the way, by Ernst Bloch. I cite it in the book. She draws more on it than I do. Okay, so that's a very quick romp through an argument. So.
I'm going to ask a couple more pointed questions that maybe you can dispense with quickly. It seems that at the heart of the idea of magical nominalism, there is an alternative understanding of the relationship between subject and object that is inspired by some comments on magic in the dialectic of enlightenment. Magic preserves the memory of the affinities between existing things that was effaced by the institution of the subject-object relationship, and it does so through mimesis. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this subject-object relation in magic, and then just a quick follow-up. I'm wondering whether your characterization of this subject-object relationship in magic still assumes the centrality of the relation of subject and object, whereas some of the instances you analyze in the event chapter, like Derrida and Deleuze and Heidegger, they are more concerned with what is prior to and what gives rise to the subject and object, so that the subject and object relationship is no longer central, it's derived, so to speak.
Well, let me take the first part, the second part first. I mean, it's quite clear that in the history of, let's say, postmodern philosophy, broadly speaking, there's a great deal of pushback against the radical distinction between subjects and objects. We call it Cartesian, we call it Kantian. There are lots of versions of subjects are here, objects are there. And there's perhaps a desire for access to something prior, something that is equiprimordial before subjects and objects crystallize out as distinct, something which Derrida called it the cora, or someone like Historiadis talked about magna, or all these terms that refer to something that is more fundamental. This discussion engages at a slightly later, we might say, point in the argument, because when nominalism is first developed, it is not trying to discover something that's equiprimordial. It doesn't want to go back to anything. It wants to open up the possibility of, let's say, humility before the unknowability of a contingent world. It is not willing to say that humans have access to that thing, reality, whatever you want to call the cora or the man that is prior to the split. So it ends up, in a way, arguing that there are subjects. Now, these subjects themselves, because the idea of the subject can itself be seen as a realistic mistake, if you universalize it, if you create a kind of idea of man with a capital M and so forth, that this also has to be what we would now call deconstructed and reduced to its nominalist parts. They're only individual men. There's no horseness, they're just specific horses and so forth. So it debunks the idea of the strong subject. So nominalism has already in its, we might say, potential arsenal, the undermining of the idea of a transcendental subject, a universal subject, a real subject, some subject that is given, or that in, say, Hegelian terms will be created over time and ingatherer world, which is one that is exfoliated. Now, having said that, the subject-object relation, I mean, once you sort of create this, is up for lots of different interpretations. And one of them is subjects dominate objects. The other is the subjects passively observe objects. The one that you mentioned is that subjects imitate or are in some ways in a kind of beneficially passive relationship to the objective world, whether it's the world of animate or inanimate objects. It could be animals or it could be windmills and so forth. One can imitate all of them. And of course, in Dialectic of Enlightenment and in the work of basically Adorno and I think Benjamin before him, the idea of being, we might say, subordinate to those objects which we imitate is an alternative to subjects dominating those objects. Now, this book doesn't really quite figure into that, because it seems to me that what it wants to do is to say that those objects are there for more than our imitation, there for more than inspiring us to be like them. They have a kind of ineffability. They have a kind of quality of thingness, of objectness, of otherness, of something that is beyond our either constitution and control or even our benign imitation. That they are part of the kind of mystery of a world which is not made for us. So it's a world that is less a source of a better version of subjectivity, which will be a benign, non-conceptually dominant one, less that than a world in which subjects simply are open to a world rather than trying either to dominate or imitate it. So I think it's a slightly different relationship. I mean, it's a very, it's a deep question because there's no single answer. And, you know, obviously people who dealt with subjects and objects have thousands of different ways of seeing them together, but I think that's as close as I could come.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the question about philosophy. You, in your introduction, distinguish between intellectual and history and philosophy in terms of the derivativeness or the secondariness of intellectual history. However, it seems to me that most people who kind of do continental philosophy are mainly commentators on the work of others. They don't write philosophy the way Descartes or Kant wrote philosophy. So even people like Derrida and Deleuze, they wrote commentaries on canonical figures in the history of continental philosophy. Is Martin J. offering a philosophy of magical nominalism? I mean, at times you point to what is attractive about it, but you also caution us about some of the limits of the different instances of it.
Well, that's a great question. It actually forced me to think through some of these intellectual history, philosophy, let's say ideotypically speaking. I'm trained as an intellectual historian. I sort of stray into philosophy and do it in a kind of semi-amateurish way, and sometimes taken seriously, sometimes not. This book is in a way parasitic on my work as an intellectual historian. I mean, it derives from work I did on, you know, the post-structure of the French discussions of visuality. It obviously draws on the Frankfurt School stuff I did at the beginning of my career and continue to do since. But in one important way, it's not intellectual history as it traditionally is written. And I mean that in two senses. First, intellectual history basically is we might say, parasitic discipline. It's derived from an awareness that there have been a lot of smart people out there who've said interesting stuff before you got around to asking the questions you want to ask. And it's incumbent upon you to explain, to contextualize, to, in some sense, critique what they said. But you're always in a kind of, I would say, subordinate relationship. So if I'm writing about Adorno, I'm not competing with him. I'm trying to elicit from him stuff that you know, he might have not explicitly said and make sense of it in a larger context, but I'm clearly derived. Now, in this book, magical nominalism is a term that I concocted. I mentioned before how I did that. So I'm not doing an analysis of what other people meant by it. And what this means, and this is also very interesting, is that I'm not doing what Reinhard Koselleck tells us Begriffsgeschichte, or the history of concepts, should do, which is to avoid a, we might say, normative definition, either the beginning or the end of a tradition, but rather simply map out the different uses of the term over time. So if I look, say if I do a history of the idea of experience, which I once did, Songs of Experience, you look at what was said by this philosopher, by this poet, in other words, you basically do a kind of desedimentation of the different meanings of the term without providing a normative definition. Philosophy often, especially analytic philosophy, no start with rigid definitions. Now, this book did not do what intellectual history did, because in the Begriffsgeschichte, the sense, because there wasn't anything to find, to follow. What it did, however, do was to avoid a kind of axiomatic definition at the beginning. So it tries also to sort of tease out the meaning of the term through those kinds of paradigms. Now, is that philosophy? Well, some philosophers obviously operate that way. I mean, that's what the doctrine of signatures that someone like Ockham points to, where it goes back to Paracelsus, I suppose, that signatures are, it's a very interesting metaphor. You write a signature, signatures look like, but are not equivalent. You know, if you look at Donald Trump's signature at the bottom of that thing to the judge, I mean, was it the same signature as, you know, that he writes now in his proclamations, you know, to create an authoritarian America? Close, not exactly the same. So signatures are always, we might say, similar, but not precisely identical. So that's, in a way, maybe a philosophy. Now, I think most philosophers, this is a terrible generalization, would feel uncomfortable with that and would try to make more precise the terms you use, try to clarify the language rather than to use it in this more evocative way. So if it is a philosophy, it's closer to the philosophy that, you know, someone like Derrida would espouse in terms of the ambivalences, the ambiguities, the catachrestic, we might say even different meanings, the operatic meaning, all fancy terms that suggest that we can't define and close down. Now, there are philosophers, Nietzsche is the great example, who said, no, if you can't, you should not define. If there's any history, there's no definition. And both Adorno and Koselleck would agree with that. So that's, I would say, my kind of comment.
So you're becoming philosopher. This
well,
book is
I mean,
philosopher.
it's a great term. I mean, you know, I would be honored to be considered one, but I'm not really, because I don't have, although I'm in conversation with philosophers, I don't live in the world of contemporary, and I, you know, benefit from contact with great philosophers at Berkeley and elsewhere. And in Europe, of course, there's a more capacious notion of philosophy than the United States. I mean, these definitions are, you know, as you say, some philosophers take their own history very seriously. Others are not interested whatsoever in anything prior to the current conversation. But these are different definitions of philosophy. I mean, they're also, you know, you can cut the pie differently. You can say with Pierre Hadot that what philosophy really is a way to tell you how to live your life. That philosophy is an exercise in right living. So someone like Foucault would be a philosopher in this sense. Kant, not so much. So, you know, philosophy has its own internal definition, distinctions. And I mean, this is not a book that argues for how you should live your life. I mean, it may argue that it's good to be open to stuff that, you know, happens to you, but it's not a, you know, a sort of manifesto. This is the way to live through exercise of your own, you know, potential as a human being and get in touch with the wonders of the world.
Okay.
Not something I could do.
One last quick question, and then I'll open up the floor to questions. So lastly, in your discussion of the relationship between magic and religion in the section on Jewish nominalism, there is an amusing quote from Gershom Scholem that says there was always a powerful reciprocal influence between the Jews and the non-Jews, for nothing is more international than magic. There are many non-Western contemporary cultures and societies where magic and spirits are part of daily life. So how would you situate magical nominalism in relation to these other places? I mean, is it mainly a Western phenomenon because it's a response to dominant strands of Western European philosophy, as they have been influenced by and sublated by Christian and Jewish monotheism?
Well, the question of how, as it were, universal the story I'm telling is obviously worth asking. It is situated in the Western tradition. I'm not, you know, I'm out of my depth in a lot of areas, but I would be drowning if I tried to do serious justice to traditions outside of Western traditions. But I think it's absolutely clear that there are other traditions, the little I know, say, of Japanese philosophy, that would, you know, clearly find something that would be resonant in this argument. And I would be more than, I'd be excited to hear what could be made of this vocabulary that I've tried to sort of, to invoke here in those traditions, whether or not there would be a recognition or whether or not there would be a sense of yes, but. So how Judeo-Christian this is, how Western it is, how much it is a reaction against the conventional nominalism that created by Franciscans in the 13th century in the West, how parochial it is, I don't know. So that's one of the hopes of the book. You write a book, I say at the very, this business about writing a late book and the last book. I'm trying to write a couple of other books at the moment, so maybe one is left. Hard to give up the habit, but the lastness, it's interesting. What you hope is, when you write a book, that it won't be the definitive study. It won't be the tombstone. It won't be the book that ends the discourse. That we'll never have another book because it's so, incredibly thorough and so, utterly unimpeachable. What you hope is the book will be, a kind of open-ended stimulus and will ultimately become, and this is the term I've used in other contexts, a debris field out of which people will then take, some sort of stimuli for their own new constellations. Very Benjaminian metaphor that, you don't treat it as if it were a kind of closed entity, but rather one that is available for pillaging. And so a book like this doesn't, I'm sure, when it gets seriously reviewed, there'll be people say, I got this wrong, that wrong, but it'll be useful. There have been already, even before it came out, I did a piece years ago, and somebody wrote an article on the Lancelot, the myths in the Middle Ages and magical nominalism. I thought, wow, that was interesting. I had no idea. So, people appropriate it. And that's the hope, that the book is not my final book, but, the beginning of other people's first, second, third, and fifth book.
Okay, so let's open it up to questions that pillage and appropriate.
And really quickly, before you answer before you ask your question, please wait until you receive this mic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I feel slightly nervous, and my question is about you began your answer to the first question talking about the world becoming unmoored because of fear and anxiety, and thinking maybe about the magical world being perhaps somewhat similar to the unconscious world. I wonder, those kinds of echoes of psychoanalysis, I wonder what happens to fear and anxiety with your cast of characters in the 20th century. And I wonder if, I want to know if humility that you speak about is the kind of countenance to that earlier terror.
Well, this is, of course, an immense and a very important question. I think in the history of, we might call it attempts to compensate for human inadequacy. In other words, we are, you can use the term thrown into the world. We are basically Mengelwesen, as the German philosopher, I think it was Galen, first said, we lack something. We don't have instincts to do what we should do. We have open-ended possibilities, which are then somehow compensated for by culture, by human innovation. And these create, we might call them, temporary ways to assuage the anxiety produced by the, let's call it, terror of being in a world that is not always friendly. A world, where wild animals want to eat us and the storms want to destroy our houses and so forth. I don't have to spell it out. Where illness happens to good people at the wrong time. In other words, we live in a world of contingency. And culture is, broadly speaking, the mechanism that we use to somehow give sense to this world. Animism, we talk about various ways in which there are spirits. We try to propitiate them. Not an anthropologist. This is all pretty obvious stuff. So what we have are temporary expedients, which give us a certain consolation. So in a way, the book argues that in the high Middle Ages, there was a kind of, at least in the West among Christians, a kind of consensus that yes, the world was rational, there was a cosmos, there was harmony, God was, basically could be rough at times, but basically was on our side, and that we could understand what was going on. And then this idea of a powerful God who didn't have to live by rules comes in a way shatters that. Because what it creates is a sense that we can't understand what God's will is. He's capricious. He's doing naughty things that are not so nice to us. He's doing stuff that we simply can't make sense of. And what this creates is, a kind of terror. And you find it in figures later like Pascal. And you even find it in Descartes, who was seen as the founding philosopher of modernity. Descartes, has to knock everything down until he gets only to the one thing that he can't doubt, which is his own, cogito. So there is a great deal of anxiety in the early modern period. How will we fill this gap? And there are various expedients that have, sometimes been successful, sometimes not. Since then, science, rationality, or the state. There are lots of things we do to comfort ourselves. And this, of course, has, as you say, a strong grounding in not only the, let's call it, species experience of vulnerability, but also the individual experience of vulnerability. I mean, humans are quintessentially dependent. We take a long time before we're even relatively independent. And so in this period of time, we are, as Freud and other people have told us, constantly caught up in relationships of anxiety and consolation, anxiety and comfort, fear and somehow a way to deal with our fears. And we never get through it. I mean, the culture doesn't get through it, the individual doesn't get through it. So it's a kind of constant, we might say, struggle to be, if not at home, at least relatively comfortable in a world which is designed to make us uncomfortable. And so that's in a way the story. So partly what I suppose the magical nominalist, compensatory myth is that yes, we can be, humble. We don't have to run the show. We can somehow also gain a kind of, temporary respite from our fear through wonder, through the ability to see the marvels of the world as not simply there to attack us, to destroy us in a kind of sublime way in which we're constantly afraid of them, but also as available to have at least singular moments of ephemeral but nonetheless meaningful, jouissance, joy, whatever kind of fancy word you want to use, which give you a certain sense of it's worth it all, that the fear can be assuaged, at least temporarily. So, this is an immense, I'm giving you kind of really hot air answers, but I think that's all I could do.
Thank you.
More questions? How about 10 more minutes?
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I haven't read the book yet, and I know, judging from the index, that the two names I'm going to ask you about are not in the book, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. Because I was wondering whether in thinking about the problem of realism and nominalism and the debate on universalia, whether you came across or thought about two lesser known names of the second generation of the Frankfurt School, who made talking about the debate of universalia as the founding problem of modernity and of critical theory, basically their life's work. Günther Mensching, who wrote his dissertation with Adorno, wrote a book called Das Allgemeine und das Besondere, spelling out this this problem, philosophical problem. And then Karl-Heinz Haag, who also did his PhD with Adorno, was supposed to be his successor when Adorno died, but then left the university, but wrote a small book of only 200 pages called Der Fortschritt in der Philosophie, Progress in Philosophy, which is only about the problem of the particular and the universal, starting from antiquity to Heidegger. Did you come across, I know you know these names. Did you think about them while researching the book and doing the book?
Well, thanks for that. I mean, I do know the names are familiar, but I have not seen these books. I mean, the issue of the universal, in particular, the issue of nominalism, realism, is so pervasive in Western thought in general and still unresolved. Contemporary philosophers spend a lot of time with it. I mean, in the Frankfurt School tradition, we might say there is a perennial tension between the Hegelian and the Benjaminian emphases. So the Hegelian emphasis was one in which universals were not given, but were part of an historical potential, we might say, which could be realized in such a way that the concrete particular would not be left behind, but would be dialectically folded into the universal. There would be an Aufhebung of the universal and the particular, at least at the end of some sort of triumphalist process, whether Hegelian or Marxist Hegelian. Now, this was one, we might say, impulse. Marcuse, in certain of his moods, I think, subscribed to this. The other, the Benjaminian one, the anti-Hegelian one, was the one that stressed the, we might say, incommensurability between the larger categories and the precise singularities of the non-identical, the name that could not be subsumed into the concept, we might say. And this is what Adorno's notion of non-identity played off. The idea that, yes, there was an identity of identity and non-identity in the Hegelian terminology, but non-identity was always a surplus, always an excess, always unrecuperable, always something that was beyond the attempt of the concept to begreifen, to grasp it. And that aspect of it was one that inspired a kind of, let's call it anti-Hegelian, and I want to call it a magical nominalist impulse in his work. Whether or not these theorists dealt with it in quite that way, I'm not sure, but I'm sure it'd be interesting to try to map on what they said with this.
Other questions? Yes.
I have what I hope is a simple question. Was Benjamin a structuralist? Because I'm thinking, was the Ursprach his idea similar to Levi-Strauss's, that something was fundamental to all human languages that got expressed in different ways?
Well, certainly there are ways in which one can cross-fertilize, let's say, Benjamin on language and later linguistic theorists. But to make a precise parallel would, I think, be hazardous. I mean, basically, Levi-Strauss, following Saussure, was a conventionalist when it came to language. And Benjamin had, we might call it a residual utopian notion that there was an Ursprache, which was prior to the fall into Babel, the fall into polyglot, or polyglossia, whatever you want to call it. And also that there was some sort of way in which names, proper names, were the real names, were ontologically the true names, rather than simply the conventional names that a relational system. So although Benjamin is certainly not a positivist, and certainly understands the importance of constellations rather than individual, let's say, entities, he's also, I would say, critical of the idea of certainly eternal forms and eternal structures, however malleable they might be in terms of the utterances that they produce. So it would be interesting to think, I'm sure there are books already on this, comparing Benjamin language with figures like Levi-Strauss, but structuralist avant la lettre, I think, would be a hard label to pin on him.
One last question.
Thank you for your talk. I found it really interesting. I'm coming at this from an art background. The surrealist, maybe it was André Breton, you can correct me if you know otherwise, introduced the concept of an objective hazard. The idea that one enters into a project, maybe very well planned, and unpredictable things happen, contingencies occur in the midst of that. And this seems very parallel, or maybe the same as the punctum, the unpredictable thing that happened in the process of making the object, making the photograph. And I wonder if that also parallels what you describe as an event in terms of within the framework of a photograph.
Right. No, it's an excellent question. I mean, they get in a little bit into the book, and the chapter on Duchamp who in a way is, Dadaist, surrealist. It's hard to describe exactly. He's almost sui generis. But he shares with them a sense of the importance of found objects rather than simply made objects, although of course both he and many of the surrealists did do making. But the idea is somehow that there is chance, that there is something that involves giving yourself up to the world rather than trying to master the world, and that allowing something to happen. There is in the Collège de Sociologie, which Bataille was, of course, a major figure, kind of shamanistic, magical moment. I particularly talk about one figure who, was I think, an historian or an analyst of shamanism who spoke at the Collège, and Bataille thought of himself at times as trying to become a shaman. I mean, whether or not he really did try to do it, I don't know. But there is a certain, I would say, slippage between the openness, sometimes they're interested in anthropological and other versions of this tradition, the openness to that, and the art that they also produced, which was in some ways athwart the idea of art as produced by the genius, by the creator ex nihilo, the artist who mastered, the world. And, this is a battle that is constantly being fought. I mean, the strong genius artist has not left us. For example, Pollock or someone like that, the powerful quality, even though there's chance, of the artist who is in control. And even the photograph, I mean, we go on in great length about the idea of contingency, the indexical, let's say, chance in a photograph. I mean, I talk about one very famous one where a photographer did a self-portrait and a fly alighted on his finger. And he included this in the ultimate print because of the sense of utter contingency. But there are other photographers and people like Michael Fried who, approve of a certain version of photography, want to banish chance, want to get rid of contingency. I was on a panel with Thomas Struth, who was a great photographer a few years ago in Chicago. And Struth is clearly someone who manages very carefully, stage manage. Everything is totally staged. I mean, the same thing, with Jeff Wall and a lot of other photographers who are approved of by Michael Fried now, who are photographers who are like artists because they get rid of contingency as best they can, rather than allow it to interfere, we might say, with their sovereign control. So there are debates that, and certainly the surrealist tradition is very much part of that, both in visual and in aesthetic, in linguistic terms. I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you. I think we should wrap it up.
Thanks.